Gig Gab 439 for Monday, July 22nd, National Mango Day 2024. Greetings, folks, and welcome to Gig Gab, the show by, for, and about working musicians here in Durham, New Hampshire. I'm Dave Hamilton. Our sponsor today is Bandzoogle, where you can use code GIGGABPOD, all one word, GIGGABPOD, to get 15% off after you get to try it free for 30 days. We'll talk more in depth about that. And today, it's just us, folks. I know, occasionally I do a solo episode because there's some things to go through. There's some things to talk about. And every one of them I've started by saying, I don't know how this is going to go. I really don't know how this is going to go. This is a let's see what happens, folks episode, because I've gotten a lot of questions here about how to set up my mixer and how to set gain structure. And while I do this all the time, I certainly don't consider myself an expert on it, but I figure it's time to start the conversation, and then you can send in your feedback to feedback@giggabpodcast.com, either questions about what we're about to talk about or corrections about what we're about to talk about. There are several ways to do this, but there are some sort of baseline things, and then we'll probably bring in an expert on this to help flesh it out. But I figure it's worth getting started with some basics. So bear with me today. We're going to do this. Now, I want to state that this podcast has always been and will always be an audio first podcast. My goal is to keep this episode that way. However, we do release video of nearly every episode, and today should, assuming the technology works, should be no exception. This video today will have a live view of the mixer, the app for the mixer that I'm using. It's the Mackie Master Fader 5 app, and I'm using it with my Mackie DL32S mixer. I'm only using one channel on the mixer for the demos and stuff that I will do today. I am going to do my darndest to describe what we are seeing and what we are doing, but there might be, in fact, there will almost certainly be some benefit to watching the video. The video is always published at giggabpodcast.com. Of course, it is on YouTube, and we also put it up on Spotify, so you can watch the videos directly in the Spotify app. Many of you, if you listen on Spotify, you probably already know that the videos are there on Spotify. So, without further ado, let's get into this. So, the idea is you're getting to a gig and you want to get stuff set up as quickly as possible. The best thing you can do is to do some setup at home first. But there's sort of a general flow that I follow when I get to a gig and need to set up everything. And of course, this would be the same flow that I would follow doing it at home ahead of time. And that's one of the beauties of digital mixers is I get to do it. We all get to do it ahead of time and save this and then recall it not just for one gig, but for every gig. And that part's really nice. But the first thing I do is I get each channel set up. And where that begins is with the gain, right? I think of this, I know these are digital mixers and top and bottom is only relative in the app, but I do think about it like an analog mixer. And I think about the top of the chain, where the sound comes in, and the bottom of the chain as to where the sound goes out, either to the speakers or to the main mix or the aux mixes, and then from there. So the main mix would be what goes out to your speakers that the audience hears. The aux mixes are generally going to be used for monitors, either wedges or in-ears, but the channels that come in are the same for both. Of course, you could do it different for both if you really wanted, but most of us, we have a microphone on stage that maps to one channel and one channel only. And so the gain structure and the whole signal path is the same for most of the channel. And then you decide how much of that channel you want in a main or in a monitor. So we start with the channel. Doesn't matter where it's going to go because we got to start with it. So the first thing I look at is the gain for the channel, because this is where the signal starts from. And the idea is, I like, on this particular mixer, I like to get a channel so that when I have the gain set correctly, it will hit about the unity part, the unity being 0, or where U is on the mixer, and not be peaking. Certainly at the top, most digital mixers, this one has about 10 decibels worth of headroom sort of above unity before it peaks out. And so I just start talking into the channel, or having someone talk into the channel, or if it's a guitar or a drum or whatever, playing the instrument. And I try to tell them, play it as loud as you possibly will during the gig so that we can find the top end. And I just start moving the gain up and down until, first of all, I get it to stop peaking and have enough signal, because you're going to be amplifying this. Whatever it is you have in there, you're going to be amplifying. And so you want more signal than not, because the part that is not signal is, at least potentially, noise. So I try to get this on this Mackie mixer. I've found that I can really get things nice and smooth and have a lot of control down the chain for if I'm right about at the cusp of where it just goes above unity to maybe 1 to 3 dB above it. Not every mixer is going to be the same in this regard. You kind of need to experiment and listen, use your ears. In addition to your eyes, I think both your ears and your eyes are important when setting up a mixer. So use your ears and your eyes as you're setting gains. And if you're watching the video, you're seeing me talking into 2 microphones. One, of course, is the one that goes to the podcast audio. And number 2 is the one that's plugged into this mixer. So once you've got the gain set, of course, I say the gain's the first thing. Really, the very first thing is plug it in, because otherwise you have what we call a high impedance air gap, meaning that, without the cable plugged in, it's really hard for the mixer to get the signal from the microphone or the instrument. And then the second thing would be whether or not you need 48 volts of phantom power for that particular input. A lot of condenser microphones, a couple dynamic microphones need it. Some other things need it. Some, you'll know. It'll say so on the device or in the manual for it. Or if you plug it in, you don't get signal, that's a good chance that it needs 48 volts of phantom power. I always hesitate to say, turn it on and try, because there are some devices, fewer and fewer as time marches on, where that 48 volts would damage them. The mic that I have here will not be damaged when I add phantom power, even though it doesn't need it. It's a Heil PR37, but it doesn't need phantom power, so I'm going to leave it off. So that's step 1 of the chain. We got our gain where we like it. I've talked into it or used it enough to know that I'm probably not going to peak it out, but I don't trust myself, and I certainly don't trust other performers, because in the moment you might wind up going a little hot. And that is where we go to compression. Compression, I'm definitely going to get this part wrong, folks, so just bear with me, but I'm going to explain it to you the way I see it, and then we'll get some feedback on this to get it right. So we've got gain set. That gain is number 1. Number 2 is compression. What compression does is gain reduction. Now, why in the world would you want to reduce gain? Well, I would want to reduce gain so that I can make sure I don't have too many peaks in my signal flow, but also I do it so that I can bring everything up and have a consistent volume, consistent perceived volume to the audience, whether I'm talking quietly or if I'm speaking loudly. I have some compression on my podcast mic all the time for exactly that reason. I want you to be able to hear me even if my level into the microphone fluctuates up or down. Most singers don't always sing at the same level. Guitars don't always play at the same level. And you want to have some it's some ability to have a difference there so that you can be musical with it, but you want everything heard. And in a live sound, especially, if you got live drums and amps and stuff on stage, you need to have a minimum level of sound. And so the idea behind compression is that you bring down the peaks so that you can bring up the overall level. And the reason we call it compression is that you are taking the dynamic range of the signal and compressing it down to be less of a dynamic range, meaning less difference, less volume difference between the quiet portions and the loud portions. Okay. With that said, the first thing you set on a compressor, well, the first thing you do on a compressor, the first thing I do is I look at the input volume and I see where that's coming in. That's helpful because I know, all right, is the signal peaking? Is the signal too low? And if it's this is a match, at least when put in line like we're talking about here, where it's the first thing in line after gain. This should match your gain exactly because there's nothing else there. There's the gain and then there's the compression. Then I look at where I want to set my threshold. The threshold is the point at which gain reduction begins. Anything below the threshold, no gain is going to be reduced. So if I'm talking quietly, we're below the threshold and there's no gain reduction. But if I'm talking loud, we get some gain reduction. So you pick where you want the threshold to be, and then you're going to pick the ratio. The ratio is what amount of how many decibels you're going to lower it for every decibel that it goes up. So if it goes up 3 dB and you want to pull it down 1, great. You got a nice little curve on it. If it goes up 3 dB and you want to pull it down 3 dB, that's a flat ratio, right? That there is no difference between the threshold point and anything louder than it. And so if you want to set up a limiter, that would be one way to do it. But we like to be musical about things, so we set the ratio, and then that's, and the nice part about a lot of digital mixers is you get to see this. You get to see the curve. You get to see when gain reduction is being kicked in. On the Mackie mixer, it's the GR column, and it comes down from the top. And then the third thing I set is what's called gain or makeup gain. So if the compression is reducing the gain, you're probably going to need to give some back to get back to that point where you like the signal to sit so that there's less noise than, less noise than signal. So you will adjust the makeup gain to sit right at about that 0 unity point when someone is talking. And if you're looking at the video, you can see I've got, if I'm talking quietly like this versus if I'm talking really loud like this, there's probably a 15 dB gap when on the input and only maybe a 4 dB gap or a 5 dB gap on the output. General rule of thumb, the perceived volume level doubles every 3 dB that you go. So use that as your math. I like to have the compression kind of sit things in about a 5 dB range, especially if I'm not out in front mixing. If we're doing what I like to call the braille mix, where you kind of just set it up and forget it for the night, I like to have about 5 or 6 dB at most so that I know where the sound is going to be. And if somebody peaks in going, well, it's going to be all right. So we've set up our gain and we've set up our compression. And now we've got sort of a nice consistent signal. And then it's time to do EQ, right? Before we talk about EQ, though, I would love to talk about our sponsor, Bandzoogle, because without our friends at Bandzoogle, a lot of us would be nowhere. Bandzoogle is absolutely fantastic. We use it here for Fling. We used it for a long time for Fling. And then as we expanded Fling from Fling into Fling Rocks Records, we were able to take our site on Bandzoogle and expand it from sort of a one-band site to a multi-band, multi-page site. They made it super easy, and that's because Bandzoogle makes it super easy to build your stunning website and, if you want, an online store for your music in minutes. And they've got all the features that you need already built in. Dozens of fully customizable templates, tools to sell your music, your merch, your tickets commission-free, industry-leading EPK features, smart links, and custom landing pages so you can do what you want, mailing list tools to grow your fan list and send your newsletters out, and they look fantastic, social media integrations to connect to your online profiles, and live support from their award-winning team 7 days a week. Website plans start at just $8.29 a month, which includes hosting and your own free custom domain name. And because you're a Gig Gab podcast listener, you can go to bandzoogle.com to try it free for 30 days and then use promo code GIGGABPOD, all one word, GIGGABPOD, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. So that's bandzoogle.com, promo code GIGGABPOD. And as always, our thanks to Bandzoogle for sponsoring this episode. All right, so we've got our gain. We've got our EQ. We've got our compression. Now it's time to go back to the mixer and talk about EQ. EQ is where things get interesting. Most of the time, as I like to say, the better sound that you can get from your instrument, from your voice, from your microphone, from matching the right microphone to the right instrument or the right voice, the better off you're going to be, because you're not going to need to do as much with EQ. And so I always say start by listening with a flat EQ and then decide what you want to do. Now, there are some general rules of thumb. On a vocal mic, on a guitar amp, I will put what's called a high pass filter in. High pass means that it filters out lower frequencies and lets through higher frequencies, right? High pass means it lets the highs pass through. And that will look on a screen or on your iPad screen or, on your mixer's screen. That kind of is represented by a curve that sort of shaves off the low end. I will put a high-pass filter on a vocal mic by default at about 100 hertz, because if somebody's singing below 100 hertz, that's atypical. And if they're not, you don't want that microphone broadcasting that 100 hertz through your monitors and your mains and muddying everything up. So you get a much cleaner signal, put on the EQ and put a high-pass filter at 100 hertz. One of my favorite things about a lot of digital mixers, including the Mackie these days, is the RTA, which stands for Real-Time Analyzer. And when you turn that on, you get to see the end result of your sound post-EQ. So where that's really handy, well, first of all, you can look at it and see, all right, well, how much signal is there below 100 hertz? And I'm looking at this mic now on this, and it's like, well, there's not much, but I'm just going to get rid of it. I don't need that down there. And sometimes, depending on the vocalist and the microphone, I might even go higher. I might go up to 150. And I know a lot of engineers, I think, start at 150. But don't forget about that. It can really help clean up your sound. And it's not something you would necessarily hear with your ears. And this is why I say we mix with both our eyes and our ears, right? Because we need to listen. But sometimes it's way easier to find especially problem stuff with our eyes than it is with our ears. And that's super true with EQ. Normally, like I said, you'd start flat, certainly with a vocal mic. I might add a little bit or pull a little bit of mid-range in or out, depending on who the singer is. And again, I'm going to start with my ears on that. But if I'm hearing something harsh in a singer's voice, and I'm going to try and talk this through. So let's say I'm talking like this and they sing like this, and you might just want to pull that out a little bit. You can go and with the real-time analyzer, you can see where that sits on the picture, on the graph, and then you just use the parametric EQ to pull it out. There are two types of EQs. I'm currently using the parametric EQ almost exclusively, almost. It's certainly what I start with. And the nice part about the parametric EQ is you have a bunch of what I'll call handles. And they, other than the one at the top, which usually is a shelf, and usually the one at the bottom is your high pass filter. So that's kind of a bell. The ones in the middle are are curves. They either go down and back up or up and back down. And the nice part about that is you can sort of pick what you want, where you want the focus of it to be. That's where you're setting the frequency and the gain, either increase or reduction, right? You're increasing gain or you're decreasing gain. You're setting the frequency, and the width or the sharpness of the curve that either goes down or up is controlled by the Q. I am podcasting right now, so I can't remember to look up what Q stands for, but it's the Q. And as you move it, you will see it on the screen as your Q either gets super narrow to focus specifically on a frequency, which is really handy. If you've got some feedback somewhere, you wouldn't necessarily do that on an instrument, but you might do it on your output EQs. Same concept applies. You can get it really narrow, or you can make it wide if you want kind of a nice, smooth EQ up or down. And again, you use your eyes and your ears to find what you want to do with the EQ. Hopefully, you're not using much EQ. You're not making gross adjustments with the EQ. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes in a pinch, especially with time constraints, that's the way to solve a problem. It's just like, okay, crap. I'm gonna pull out a lot of, whatever 1K here, and maybe make a note of, like, for the next gig, get this person on a different microphone, right? I often will make the top, the highest EQ a shelf, so that I can either sort of pull all of the high end out or add a little bit of sparkle to the high end by increasing it by a dB or two. If you're making, and I said before, you want to make small adjustments. If you're making EQ adjustments more than 3 dB, there's probably something else that needs to be addressed. But again, in a pinch, do what you need to do. Don't worry about the rules. If it sounds right and it works, you go play the gig, right? Show must go on. So that's the parametric EQ. And again, you just experiment with this. But if your mixer, and most of them have an RTA, that real-time analyzer, that lets you see what you're doing to the signal and where the signal is, makes it so much faster to dial in the EQ. It's funny, I used to, before we had these, you learned how to do it by ear. You'd say, okay, it's probably 250 hertz. That's where it's rumbling. Let me drop some of that. And I got really good at it just from doing it over time. I had to do it at a gig where I subbed a few weeks ago, the one where there was like this 8-channel analog mixer and they had some outboard graphic EQs. And I'll talk about what a graphic EQ is in a minute. And I couldn't trust my ears anymore. I had forgotten how to hear and relate that to a frequency, because I've gotten so spoiled by having it literally appear in front of me on the real-time analyzer. But these are good problems to have. So that's the parametric EQ, the one with different handles that you can just put where you want and move the frequency left and right, and then the gain up or down. There is the graphic EQ, which is what we all saw on our stereos as kids. And I'm trying to find it here on this mixer, and it doesn't look like I can have it with this particular app, which is weird because I know this mixer can do a graphic EQ, but evidently this version of the app doesn't show it to me. It's fine. A graphic EQ is like what you've seen on old stereos, or if you're old and had a stereo, what you might have had on a stereo, and they can be, a 5-band graphic EQ or a 32-band graphic EQ, where there is one knob, either virtual or physical, for any given frequency range. You don't get to move the knobs left and right across the frequency range. You just get to pick, all right, this is the frequency, I'm going to dump it, or this is the frequency, I'm going to raise it. And you don't get to decide how wide or narrow it is. That's been pre-decided by the manufacturer. So that is that's what a graphic EQ is. Where I wind up using those is if I have to tune feedback and I've already got an EQ, kind of a musical sounding EQ set with the parametric, I might use the graphic, and again with a real-time analyzer, or not if you don't have one, you can see where the feedback is, and you just go dump that one slider and one fader, I guess, and you're good to go. So we've talked about gain. We've gone through a lot. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope this is valuable. I'm trying to keep it descriptive enough that while you're listening in your car, You can follow along. Please let me know. Feedback at Gig Gab Podcast. This is truly an experiment. GigGabPodcast.com, that is. Truly an experiment, but I think we're getting somewhere, but you are the actual judge of that, and it means a lot to me. So let me know, but also go back and watch the video. So that's what I would do for every single channel. And I would do that if the EQ you probably can't set before turning on speakers, right? Because you want to be able to hear what you're changing on the EQ. It's not all visual. But the rest of it, the compression and the gain, you absolutely can. And I recommend you set that before you start turning on speakers, because before you start bringing faders up and all that stuff, because you're going to want to, because you can do that without needing to hear it. And that way you don't have to worry about goosing the gain and causing feedback and blowing everybody's ears out and all that stuff. So that's sort of the order of operations. After that, then it's time, you do it for all the rest of the instruments, of course. One thing I will note is that with drums, especially a bass drum, in order to really make the speakers activate, the subwoofers especially activate, you're going to want more gain out of it than I would with a vocal mic. I want every time the bass drum is hit that it goes well, a couple of dB past unity. You don't want it peaking, you don't want it clipping, but you definitely want it a couple dB past unity. And then you can apply a lot of compression to a bass drum to, to kind of keep that tame. Most of the time in a rock environment, you don't necessarily need a lot of difference between a soft bass drum hit and a loud bass drum hit. You kind of just want a bass drum hit. There are certainly environments, like when I play with Bitter Pill, we have some songs where it's, the overall dynamics of the band sort of go up and down. So with that, I'm a little more judicious when I'm applying compression to it. But otherwise, you kind of want a lot of compression on a kick drum. There are some instruments that require lots of compression. Depending on how your bass player plays and how you want your sound to be, the bass can also be sort of heavily compressed and still sound really good. There's lots to get into, and I'll sort of leave it at that. There's experiment with it. See what you like, see what works for you, and then you will know what works for you. Once you have done that, then it's time to, I would start. Usually I would start with the monitors. So, maybe I would call it aux 1, mic monitor 1. And what I do is I bring the levels of everything, especially microphones, things that are in the monitors. I bring those down. Then I bring the overall level of the monitor down. Again, this is just to be kind to your fellow musicians and the audience, whoever's in the room, the staff at the place. And I unmute the monitor output. I slowly bring the main monitor output up, making sure that I don't accidentally have something unmuted or live in it that I didn't want. Great. I bring that up to usually I'm about 3 dB below unity. I might go up or down from there depending on, how the speakers are wired and if they're active or passive and what the vibe of the room is. But generally speaking, I get pretty close to, but not over unity. And then I start bringing up microphones, right? And so I'll bring up a microphone, and then I sort of quickly bring up the real-time analyzer for the parametric EQ. And it's at this point that I'll start dialing in sounds. And here you might wind up using more than 3 or even 5 dB on this, because the reflections in the room, all of those things are now at play. It's not just, do you have the right microphone on the right person? You have no idea what a room is going to be like until you learn that room. So if you're looking at my screen, you can see I have some pretty gross or pretty serious, severe adjustments on this. This is from the last gig I played, and this was outside, but this is what it took. Usually outside is a little more forgiving than indoors, but there was a not flat wooden roof over the stage. It was a wood stage.
And they were kind of weird speakers that we were using. So, and there was a fan blowing. So there was a lot of things to sort of account for. And I when I'm doing this, I know no shame. I will adjust it. I'll use my eyes to help me find where certainly feedback is. And then I will adjust it until that feedback is gone. And certainly if there's something that seems overly problematic, I might move a monitor speaker or move a microphone. But otherwise, I just do it. And I know no shame. And I don't know what other engineers, I say other engineers. I don't know what real engineers, maybe I could just say engineers because I'm certainly not one. I don't know what a typical engineer's, monitors might look like, but this is what worked on that gig. And like I said, I have no shame about it. And since I knew we weren't putting instruments other than acoustic guitars in the mains, I also put a high pass filter on the monitors. We were putting everything in the mains, but in the monitors, we weren't putting instruments other than acoustic guitars. So I put a high pass filter on the monitors as well, so that we just didn't put any of that stuff. We didn't add more rumble to the stage accidentally. Once I do that, then if there's a lot of feedback, like I said, I will use that graphic EQ. This mixer view does have a graphic EQ for the outputs. And so if you're looking again at my screen, you will see that it is flat. I didn't do any adjustments here, but if there was one frequency that was sort of problematic, I might just dump it and, and get myself to where I need to be. Again, no shame. Just use your eyes and your ears. As long as in the end it sounds good to your ears, then you're good to go. You can put compression on an output. You can see that the compressor is on this one, but there is no makeup gain, and the threshold is well above anywhere the speaker would go. There's no gain reduction happening. Generally speaking, I wouldn't put compression on a monitor speaker because you're just asking for an opportunity to create more feedback or amplify feedback that is there. But I definitely would put compression on my in-ears. I had turned it off here, but you can see if you're looking, I basically set a brick wall limiter at a point where I know that I'm not going to get blown out in my ears, and yet I'm still going to get all the sound that I need to get. So I would use it there. There are some people that use compression on mains. Again, it depends on the size of the room, the size of the stage, what you're doing, but compression on the mains can certainly be helpful. I've got some on the mains for this particular gig, for this mix. And so that's really it. There's a lot. Well, it's not it. There's nothing. We're not even close to it. However, we've gone through a lot, and there's a lot to digest. I've told you more than I know already, but hopefully it's a start, and hopefully it makes sense. Certainly, if you have used a mixer before, some of hopefully some or most of this is like, oh, I've seen that, didn't know what it was for. There's other things that you could do, but this is the gist of what I do every time I get to a gig. I will, because I'm super stoked about learning this little trick, I will share what I do with one piece of advice that we got from a truly real engineer, the real engineer, Robert Scoville. He's the one who's out with Kenny Chesney. We had him on the show a month and a half ago or so. And he talked about how even in a small environment, for him, it was the front of, the first 8 rows of Tom Petty's stage. But for all of us, it's, the entire room, because we're basically playing to, 8 to 15 rows of people. Most of us aren't playing stadiums or even sheds or anything, larger than, several hundred people. He said he would put delays on the speakers. The reason being, you want anything that's live on stage to be in time with the signals that are coming out of the speakers, or sort of more correctly, you want the speakers to be in time with anything that's live on stage. And generally speaking, that's going to be the snare drum, because that's going to be loud, hearable, audible to the people in those first 8 rows, right? Or anywhere in the club. So what you don't want is the sound coming off the snare drum and then a mic'd snare drum coming out of the speakers at the same moment in time, because they're both going to travel forward at the same speed, and the speed of sound is such that you have about a 1 millisecond delay per foot of travel. It's not exactly that, but that's close enough. And so what he likes to do is measure the distance between the snare drum and the front of the stage and then set a delay on the mains. And this is all the mains, not just the snare drum in the mains, vocals, everything. You've got all the sound leaving the stage at the same time. So the snare drum is hit, and then however many milliseconds later, everything comes out of the speakers from that moment. Probably not perceptible to people in there, but you avoid all those comb filters, which means two sounds arriving at the same sound arriving at different times and causing problems. Reflections can also cause comb filters, but at the very least, you are starting without one. So I will bring the mixer interface back up. This is the output on the mains that you are seeing. This mixer has the ability to simply set a delay on it. And what's really cool is you only have to put the number of feet in. Of course, it's not showing it on the Mac app, I swear. Oh, yeah, it is. It's showing it at the top of the screen if you're looking. So I've pulled it out 3.5 feet, and it's showing 3.1 milliseconds of delay. But that's the snare drum's probably not 3.5 feet from the front of the stage or where the speakers are. Don't measure from the snare drum to the speaker on the side of the stage. Measure from the snare drum to the line between the speakers that would be the front of the stage. So go straight out. Usually it's going to be about, maybe 15 feet, maybe 10 feet, depending on, what the stage is. So you're probably going to add 10 to 15 milliseconds. But all you got to do is measure that. Now, you ask, Dave, how would you measure that? Well, if you have an iPhone, there is a measure app on it. And what's cool is you can stand in one spot, point the measure app. It uses your camera. You point it at the snare drum. You drag it around. You literally move it in space, aim it at the point at the front of the stage and press, and it will give you a measurement. And then all you got to do is dial that measurement into your mixer and you're golden. So that's my last little bonus sort of expert tip, but makes a huge difference. And it's something we can all do. And it takes 10 seconds to do this. I love that our digital mixers let us do all this stuff. So that's it. That's all I'm going to do. I promise there's no more. Except I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to say thank you for listening. Please send in your feedback about this. Feedback at giggabpodcast.com. I'm really eager to get your reactions to this, both for watching the video and even more so for listening to the audio. If it was difficult to follow on the audio and you got this far, thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening. Thank you for all the feedback that you send in. Thank you for sharing the show with all of your friends. I love hearing from people that are like, oh yeah, my guitar player listened to this and they sent it to me and I love it now and I'm going to share it with other people. Hopefully you're getting valuable stuff out of this. If you're not the one in your band that does the sound, well, you've listened this far, so you've learned something about that. You don't necessarily have to tell them that you know. It's sometimes better not to be the one that knows about sound, except when there's an emergency and you can just step in and fix it. But maybe pass this episode along to someone that does do the sound. Go to giggabpodcast.com for me, would you please? And sign up for the mailing list. That way we can tell you when the episodes are out. And we can also send you fun little things. We promise we don't spam you. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And hey, always be performing. See you next week. Later.